Hey there everybody, it's Mark Crilly. I'm back with another How to Draw video. Today we're going to be learning how to design for a portrait-shaped panel versus a landscape-shaped panel. And each one of these is going to have the same scene as if I were doing a comic book and I only had space for this type of a panel or this type of a panel. How would I adjust that illustration to fit that panel shape? And what I've done here is I've put a bit of narration to make it really feel like it's from a story. There wasn't much time. I needed to finish the job and get out of there quickly. And my idea is I'm going to draw an assassin lurking in an alleyway preparing to take care of a job on some unsuspecting citizen. And what I've done here is to print out the text in two different shapes, because I want to show you that I would likely even have the text be in two different shapes, adjusting to the size of the panel. Now this normally would not come in until the very end, because I like to do all of my text in Photoshop almost like on a completely separate layer. I don't work it into the artwork, but I like to be aware of it in advance so that I can design my artwork around it. So let's not waste any more time. Let's go ahead and get into this first panel design. So for the time being, I'm going to leave this right here so that I know what kind of space is available to me as an artist. And I guess the first thing is, since I imagine this assassin lurking in an alleyway, I'm going to start to put in some lines for the shape of the alleyway. Now I'm going to make it super narrow, and that is in response to this panel shape, frankly. And I guess I could move this out of the way. I would just go ahead and finish the art, you know, even though it's probably going to get covered up later on in the process. I need enough space to put somebody sitting on a park bench. It wouldn't be a park bench, I guess a street bench over here. So let's go ahead and begin to put that in. Let's say we have enough space for sidewalk in this area right here. We'll see just a little bit of the street. And I might give this location a bit of European flair, because I just came back from Norway, had a wonderful trip there, met all kinds of fabulous artists and people and comic fans, and I guess I'm a little inspired by those beautiful Norwegian locations. But let's go ahead and we'll draw the first hint of a bench here, where a guy is going to be sitting reading a newspaper. And you know, I'm going to do just really rough layout stuff here, and then later on I'm going to tighten it up and do finished line work all in time lapse. But I would definitely want to get the guy sitting here on the bench and put him in frame so that I can sort of design around him as I continue making the rest of the illustration. Now, you know, with a park bench is a very horizontally shaped thing, and that's why I've made this decision to kind of crop it halfway through, just in terms of how else am I going to fit the two different things, because the assassin's going to be back here in the alleyway. So we'll keep this real short and sweet here in terms of this person sitting on the bench, and then move back into doing this alleyway. So I imagine maybe we can see up into the alley just a little bit. Let's imagine that a shadow is being cast by this building over here on this side, and so all of this is going to end up in darkness. One thing you might notice is that instead of making this line exactly parallel, I've made it sort of leaning over a little. That's a kind of an artistic preference of mine. I feel like the image would be a little static and dead. Same thing's happening here with the street, right? I'm not just following that line, I'm going off a little. I can't imagine I'm the only artist who has these instincts. You're trying to create interesting, odd shapes, you know. And so let's go ahead and imagine that there is an assassin back here, and we'll make it a deadly femme fatale female assassin who's lurking. When I was on the plane, I watched Atomic Blonde. I'm so easily influenced by things that have happened to me, but in that film we have a very, very cool female. I don't know if she's an assassin, but she's a spy. She knows how to defend herself. So I'm putting the just in silhouette form. She's maybe got her gun so that we can see the shape of that and imagine that she's ready to do her dirty work. And this is a big part of what I'm doing to begin with, sort of figuring out the important characters in the scene and what that's going to look like. And after I've got that stuff kind of taken care of, then I can figure about the, stuff that's just a little more decorative or giving you information about the environment, or sometimes just for me it's just finishing off what would otherwise look like too blank of a space. So let's go ahead and move this back in here. Notice that I've tried to create this so that it would come right here. You don't want a line that lines perfectly up. That becomes a problem, right? So that's what I've tried to make this so that it gets deliberately cut off a little bit. Again, these are things that just my personal preferences, but it does tend to just look better, in a designy way. But I've got all of this space here, and I think what I'll do is say, hey, let's put a window over here to mainly just to fill up all this dead space here. I don't want a panel that is completely blank, and sometimes having a huge blank space, it becomes distracting in a way. The eye keeps going to it and saying, wanting it to be filled or wanting to understand why was this space left so blank. And so I'm going to just very quickly put in some window frame lines there. And beyond that, we're kind of running out of space to put stuff. I never want my panels to become too crowded, but let's go ahead and, for me, it doesn't look like a sidewalk until we've got some lines there that sort of convey that sidewalk, that classic sidewalk shape. I'm not going to get into too many details until later, but let's go ahead and put in some lines here for the wood, the wooden struts or beams of the bench itself. And, maybe there's just about enough space to put in some kind of potted plant. I saw a lot of that in Norway. This is mainly, we're getting into sort of composition stuff. And is it necessary for storytelling? No, not at all. It's there really just to sort of complete the image. But I'm going to put in just a few hints of the cobblestones. I love these cobblestones that I saw in Europe. I don't know if I'm doing it properly. Probably I'm not. But I'm going to go ahead and give a little suggestion of these beautiful cobblestones that I saw in Norway, and that's going to be something I'm going to tighten up later on. But that kind of thing, these little details will add to the atmosphere. And especially if this was a story that was set in Europe, you do want to get some of those little details in there. And this is looking blank to me. I thought, how about if we put in a pattern of big stone bricks that you sometimes see at the edge of a building that will kind of cap that off. And then I become, aware that unfortunately this is going to get covered up, but I'll go ahead and draw it. I just won't put loads of detail in that area knowing that it's going to get covered up by the speech bubble. How about some wires? I did this a lot in Brody's Ghost. I would use electrical wires and maybe put some birds on them or something to sort of finish up this space. Again, I got to keep that in mind, what's going to be there. How about if there's some distant box, like an air conditioning unit or something that fills that up, giving you guys a sense of decisions that you make as an artist that are mostly about composition rather than as things that are essential to telling the story. And maybe we can see a little bit of buildings in the far distance here that will be very kind of pale and just give this a sense of depth. And maybe that's enough for that. All the rest of it I think I'm going to consider detail work that I'll get to later on. Let's go ahead and refocus the camera. We're going to move over to this other panel and see how much things change as we try to rejigger the composition to make it appropriate to this type of panel shape. All right, so we've moved over here, and again, I've got my text in place to see what is left over for my drawing. And you might think, well, it's just a matter of cropping the image differently, but as a comic book artist, I'm going to say, no, there's more to it than that, because especially if this is a location that only shows up in your story once, I might, come up with a different shape for the width of the alleyway given this panel. Shape that is so much more horizontal. So let's go ahead and move a line in here for the building and create quite a big gap, much larger than we had in the other illustration because we've got so much more space to work with. And of course, as I was saying, the bench is this naturally very horizontal thing. So in this version of the drawing, I'm not going to crop that bench. I'm going to go ahead and put the entire bench into the illustration because I've got the available space for it this time. So I'm going to go ahead and dash this in real quickly. And one thing that I think I would change if I were given this completely different panel shape is I wouldn't have him sitting over here as he was in the previous illustration. I would move him over to the other side of the bench and have him sitting over here. Now you might wonder why. Why are you doing that? Well, this becomes compositional stuff. And I've got a frame that is this wide. I know I'm going to have that same assassin character standing back here somewhere. If I put him right here, the whole thing becomes a little weighted too heavily in terms of where the characters are. It starts to feel like, well, why did you make this panel so wide if you only needed enough space for these two characters close together? Anyway, that's my thinking that he can be sitting on either side of the bench, and I've decided for this version of the illustration to put him way over here. It's going to look better, I think. So, all of this is, this is not so much a video about how to draw someone sitting on a bench. Hopefully you're getting like general principles here of how artists will change the drawing to fit the panel. And again, I'm going to do a lot more detail work on this. He's like reading a newspaper. I'm going to do a lot more detail work on this in time-lapse as we wrap this thing up or, get into the final part of the illustration. But hopefully this gives you a sense of how I'm making a radically different choice in terms of the way the bench is portrayed, drawing the entire thing rather than just a portion of it. Then over here, as I said, we've made this whole thing a little wider. I feel like we can bring the point of view of the camera down a little bit. That last one was a little more like viewed from above. This one, where I think we're dropping down a little lower. And I'll go ahead and draw that same assassin character back here. Gun in hand. Ready to take care of the job. But in terms of the composition and how much space she occupies within, proportionally within this alleyway, you're going to see later on when we compare these two images, it's quite a bit different. Just because the super narrow alleyway made sense when the panel was super narrow, top to bottom. I feel like, well, I've got more space now, side to side. Let's go ahead and make the alley itself less wide, because you, as an artist, you almost have this ability to play God. You can on the fly decide how wide or narrow this alleyway is. As I said, especially if it's a location that only comes up one time in your story, why not just make it perfect for the panel that you're working on, so that you have a good-looking panel. This time, I think there's enough space for us to see these bricks, so that's going to be a little bit of a difference. that this sort of decorative brick pattern on the edge of the building is going to be much more visible in this version than it was in the other. And, I feel like we end up with more space over here, so why not drop in some kind of a window? I'll make it different from the other window that I did. Maybe give it a little bit of an arch at the top. And why did I put that in? Just because there's space for it. When you go back and look at the other illustration, we will see that there was no such space for any more window stuff to be included in that part of the drawing. But here we've got space for window, and in that first one, the window was like right here behind him. It made sense within that illustration to put it there. I think in this illustration, it makes sense to put the window back there. So I'm going to just maybe put the real rough hint of the window like so, right here, and then maybe move this out of the way. Again, sort of realizing that this shutter is not going, some of it is going to get covered up by that text, and just sort of make my peace with that. But at least I know in advance, okay, this stuff is going to get covered up. So don't get too heartbroken as you put work into these window panes, for example. Just know in advance a good chunk of it is going to vanish behind the speech bubbles. That's something I get a little obsessed with, and trying to avoid putting loads of time into a part of the drawing that is not going to end up seen by anyone because it gets covered up by speech bubbles. Whereas this area that's looking quite blank to me, if there were no narration, I might be tempted to put something in there. But knowing, the speech bubble thing, the narration becomes part of the composition, really. And so that this is not going to look so blank because you don't see so much there. But over here, we certainly have lots of space to play around with, and I might end up putting a little more in terms of like buildings that can be seen back here. I'll just play around with a little more visual information in the back, maybe a parked car, or something that I didn't bother with in that previous illustration because there just wasn't the space for it. But yeah, there's certainly more space for playing around with background stuff. We'll make it sort of European with unusually spaced windows. And that maybe is getting us to where we need to be. Maybe we can squeeze in one or two more of those electric wires that I like with little birds perching on them. There's not going to be a whole lot of space for the road, that kind of pattern that I was getting into that was made out of cobblestones. But let's just stick with that and figure that there's whatever space there is. Like I said, I've moved the camera down a little bit, so we're sort of seeing this a little more from the side. So on the fly, I'm kind of adjusting that. And again, in time-lapse, I'm going to get into the detail of this cobblestone. For now, it's mainly about just showing you guys the different compositions that become available, and I might throw in a little brickwork when I get into the details of both of these illustrations. You're going to see a lot of stuff happen in time-lapse. And what I'm going to do is probably scan it into my computer, maybe tone things up just a little bit and print it all out. And when we come back, we can finally compare what are the key differences between these two different versions, these two different panels that are containing largely the same thing, but tweaked and sort of pushed around so as to adjust them to the shape of the panel that they were made for. So let's go ahead and finish this all off in time-lapse, and in a minute I'll be back with a few final words. right, well, I took the finished illustration, I scanned it into my computer, and ta-da, this is what it looks like after a little bit of trickery in Photoshop. But the main thing really is to compare the differences between these two compositions. And I treated this as being about, you know, comics creation, but really this has to do more with any form of art. When you're trying to fill a certain shaped canvas, you're going to be making choices like I made here, adapting these different illustrations. I added a little thing of flowers here. This area looked a little empty to me. It's sort of interesting to compare what's different between the two different things, all sort of based on instinct and what looks best within each composition. But I hope that you found this helpful. Before I go, though, I always like to say thank you to anyone who has supported me by getting any of my books, like the 2-pencil method. A lot in here about composition, that kind of thing, mastering manga. This one's going to give you everything you need to know about drawing manga and about creating comics in general. Speaking of which, my very latest book, The Comic Book Lesson, a graphic novel that teaches you how to draw. Very excited about people responding to this quite positively as they read the story and learn quite a bit about making comics. But I think it's time for me to lay down this pencil right here in this spot that seems left blank just for laying down a pencil. And I guess it's time for me to thank you all for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back with another one real soon.